Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews. We're still looking at Hebrews chapter 11, the great faith chapter. Now in this chapter, the author of Hebrews gives us what we could call the roll call of faith. He gives us example after example of men of faith in the past who've showed us the path of believing in God, living by trust in Him. So far, we've talked about Enoch. We've talked about Abel. We've talked about Noah. And now the author is beginning to talk to us about Abraham. Now, he's going to talk about Abraham in two separate paragraphs. First in verses 8 through 12, he would talk about Abraham. And then again in verses 17 through 19. He's going to give us a lot of detail about Abraham, the great man of faith. Now, we would expect this because we know that all through the New Testament, Abraham is lifted up as the great example of what it is to believe in God. The Apostle Paul in the book of Romans spends a lot of time talking about Abraham as our example of believing and trusting, of having faith. He reminds us that in the book of Genesis it says, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him for righteousness. Yes, the way of righteousness, of right relationship with God, comes through faith. Abraham shows us that. And so we have these two paragraphs in Hebrews chapter 11 talking about the faith of Abraham. Let's read those quickly. First, verses 8 through 12. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place that he would later receive as an inheritance, he obeyed. He went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, she was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so, from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. And then going to verse 17. By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. And so Abraham is listed as that great example of believing the promises of God. Now notice in these two paragraphs, there are three parts of Abraham's life and his faith that are lifted up. First, when he believed God and went to a foreign country. When he was called to go to a land he did not know, to be a pilgrim in that land, because God promised one day this land would belong to your descendants. That was the first part of his believing. Then the second part is with Sarah, his wife. God had promised that you and Sarah will have a child, and through that child all my promises to you will be fulfilled. But Abraham was old, and Sarah was old. They were past the age of childbearing. That promise seemed physically impossible. And yet Abraham believed if God had said it, he would deliver. And then the third part of the faith of Abraham is after Isaac was born, when God said, offer him as a sacrifice to me. Remember, God had told God to take Isaac to Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice. Now, he was the child of promise. How could he be a sacrifice? And yet Abraham believed that God could even bring him back from the dead. That somehow God would still fulfill his promises, and he was prepared and ready to obey God. So these three great examples of faith, going to a foreign land, believing it will one day be yours, believing that somehow you and your wife could have a child, even though you're old and well past the age where it can happen, and then being willing to offer that child up in sacrifice when he is supposed to be the child of promise. How could such a thing be? In all three of these ways, Abraham demonstrated his faith. It is through that faith, through that trust, he knows the saving power of God. Now, in the days to come, I want to look at these three aspects of Abraham's faith in a little more detail. So we're going to spend a few days talking about Abraham, the great man of faith, and each of these three aspects of how his faith was demonstrated. So join us tomorrow as we continue looking at Abraham, this great man of faith. Hope you'll be with us for our next 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews.